Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming, Your Holiness. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you and all of you today. Yesterday, much of the world was riveted when Felix Baumgartner stepped out of a balloon-borne capsule, 127,000 feet, I believe, above the surface, and parachuted to the surface. Before he stepped out of that capsule, he remarked that the world from 127,000 feet made him feel, as a human being, to be extremely small indeed. And I think all of us, at one point or more in our lives, perhaps not so dramatically as Felix Baumgartner, has had the experience of feeling very small. And yet, we've come to realize that collectively, in some sense, we've become very large on this planet, and we're beginning to change the planet in ways which may not be beneficial. And I'm here this morning to sort of set the stage by talking about what my field of climate science understands the problem to be. I'd like to begin with a little bit of historical context. It's often mistakenly assumed that our realization that we're changing the climate is a very recent one. In fact, it goes back more than 100 years. The man you see in this photograph, Svante Arrhenius, was a Swedish chemist, a Nobel Prize winner, who was very interested in the fact that we were changing the composition of the atmosphere. And he was perhaps the first to realize that massive combustion of fossil fuels would do that. And he did some calculations. I don't need to tell this audience that back at the turn of the last century, there was no such thing as a digital computer. There were no climate models. But just using basic physics, pencil and paper, he came to the conclusion that you see stated here, that doubling the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would raise the Earth's temperature by about 4 degrees centigrade. And if we were to increase it fourfold, the temperature would rise by 8 degrees C. Now, he couldn't foresee how quickly the Industrial Revolution would accelerate, so he thought it would take us 1,000 years to do this. But now it looks more like on the order of 100 or 150 years for doubling CO2. So this is this idea that we have the capacity to change our planet is not a very new idea, at least not in the West. Arrhenius's prediction is somewhat borne out, which you can see in this graph. It's a simple graph in which the blue curve is the natural logarithm of the CO2 concentration normalized at some year, and the green curve is a history of the mean surface temperature of the planet. And you can see by the fact that the line varies, it's a squiggly line, that of course there's natural variability of the climate, we all know that. And that natural variability is on many time scales, only some of which you can see in a graph that only spans 100 years or so. But the planet is warming up. Amongst climate scientists, even those who count themselves as skeptical, there is no denial of this fact or even of its relationship to carbon dioxide. The real question is not whether this is happening, but what will be the consequences of this going forward, and should we and can we stop it from happening? So the dilemma for our generation is that if we choose to do something about this, we have to make that choice very soon. We don't have the luxury of waiting, and that's a scientific issue, and it's shown by these two graphs. So the graph at the top shows a projected evolution of the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere, and it's assumed that when the concentration reaches some level, like 450 or 550 parts per million, we'll suddenly stop emitting CO2 for the purposes of this graph. And then nature takes over. And if we burn just about everything so that we get up to well over 1,000 parts per million, you see the curve at the top. The point is that once we stop doing this, it takes a long, long time for this excess carbon dioxide to go away. Nature does take it away. It takes literally thousands of years. And so if we're going to stop this from happening, you can see by those curves, we have to make that decision quite soon. The graph at the bottom shows one of our best estimates of the consequence of that increased greenhouse gas content for the temperature of the surface. And you can see that that recovers even more slowly. So the point is, whatever your perspective on how dangerous this is, if we are going to do something about it, the choice is a choice that this generation has to make. That's simply a scientific fact. One of the consequences that climate scientists are very concerned about is what happens to sea level. I think I skipped a curve. Maybe I didn't. Well, I did. One curve seems to have been left off of this. But right at the moment, we're projecting that in 100 years, sea level will increase by an order of a meter or so, which is enough to disrupt a lot of coastal cities. A great deal of the human population of the planet lives very close to sea level. Now, that 1 meter, the purpose of this graph is to show you that 1 meter by long time-scale geological standards is a very conservative estimate. So what this graph shows are estimates over history, over geological history of the sea level at various times. That's on the y-axis, versus estimates of what the global mean temperature was. So 20,000 years ago, which is a blink of an eye geologically, there's no doubt the sea level was about 120 meters lower than at present. That's a lot. You could walk from Boston to Provincetown if you wanted to back then, if you could get out from under the ice, that is. Today, the dot in the center represents today, and everything's relative to today in sea level when the mean temperature is about 15 degrees. During the Pliocene period, 3 million years ago, carbon dioxide was actually a little bit less than today, although considerably greater than pre-industrial values. The sea level was some 30 meters higher than today, and that open circle that you see is our projection. And you can see that in geological context, it's a very conservative projection of sea level. Another consequence of changing climate that has us worried is heat waves. We are adapted to a particular climate biologically. We can tolerate big extremes of temperature, but when they start to become too extreme, we begin to suffer. The heat wave in Europe in 2003 is estimated to have killed about 35,000 people. That was an extraordinary event. Even conservative projections of temperature on the planet suggest that this will be commonplace in about 50 years. What was an extraordinary event a few years ago will become fairly commonplace. Hydrological extremes increase with temperature. And this is one of the robust things that we understand about the climate system. You don't need supercomputer models to tell you this. And that means that we expect to see an incidence, increased incidence, both of floods and of drought. This summer, of course, the last few summers in the United States particularly, we've had an illustration of just how seriously drought can affect our economy and, in fact, the world's economy. My own field, as mentioned in the introduction, is hurricanes. I do a lot of work on hurricanes, fascinating phenomena. And we stumbled across this fact. This red curve shows the power generated by hurricanes historically in the North Atlantic Ocean, going back to the end of the 19th century. That's in red. And if you look at the numbers on the right side of the graph, you don't have to know what those units are. You can see that over just in the last 20 or 30 years, that the power of North Atlantic hurricanes has actually more than doubled. That's a big change. The blue curve is ocean temperature in the hurricane breeding places of the North Atlantic, and there's a strong correlation between these two. We understand parts of that, but not all of that correlation, and that's another reason to worry given how destructive hurricanes are. Something not mentioned as often as it should be is that merely putting carbon in the atmosphere changes the chemistry of the ocean. Some of the carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean, lowers the pH, increases its acidity. And we have an expert on the panel on this, Penny Chisholm, who you might hear more about this later. But this is a serious concern as the acidity of the ocean increases. It begins to threaten those principally microorganisms that build shells. And this could really seriously change, and there are some indications that it is seriously changing the whole ecology of the ocean. Thank you. Now, amongst people who take security seriously, including our own Defense Department in the United States, this is a very major problem, climate change. So the U.S. Department of Defense issued its last quadrennial defense review in 2010, and I won't read these quotations, I'll let you read them. They're very worried about climate change effect on world stability, because historically, food and water shortages have been a major contributor to political destabilization and to armed conflict in the world. So, for example, in the recent Arab Spring, there are, of course, all kinds of deep political reasons why those rebellions occurred. But there was also a proximate reason, which was a high price of food in that region, driven by drought. And so our Department of Defense is extremely concerned about climate change and are quietly trying to see what can be done about it. So I'm going to leave this as what I consider to be a central question for debate today that I think has caused a lot of difficulty, particularly in the United States. And that is, how can we, by we, I mean basically my generation, maybe your generation if you're younger, be persuaded to make material sacrifices, maybe to suffer a slight diminishment of our standard of living, to reduce serious risks of climate change, given that our own generation will not be the primary beneficiaries of our actions? Is it possible for one generation to make sacrifices for future generations, especially if they're more than 1 or 2 generations downstream? Has it been done before? Can it be done? And I'll leave you with those thoughts. Thank you.
So, Kerry, you gave a very cogent presentation, and you've left us with an obviously important question for the audience and all of us to think about. But just want to begin the dialogue by asking you a simple question. What you're telling us is not new, and you've been working on this for a long time. Why do you think it is so difficult to get this message accepted or understood by the American public or by the general public? Why are people so resistant to this message?
I think the resistance to this message, when looked at in historical context, is nothing particularly new. And one weak analogy, but one that bears some contemplation, is the ramp up in the United States to World War II in the 1930s. It's very interesting to read, for example, Eric Larson's account of the experiences of our ambassador to Germany in the 30s. In the Garden of the Beasts is the name of his book. And it is another instance where it became apparent, I think, certainly by the late 1930s, that there was a real threat in Europe and in other places. And most people who thought about that understood the threat, and yet Americans, and in fact people, not just Americans, were very reluctant to accept that. There was a great resistance to trying to do anything about that during a time when we probably could have done something relatively mild about that. And maybe it took Pearl Harbor to really engage the American public in the idea that that threat had to be dealt with. Now, it's a weak analogy because that threat was real, it was there, and it affected us, not just our children. The difficulty about this threat is if we don't do anything about it, we're not going to suffer very much. Not me, not somebody in his 50s. It's evolving slowly. And that's what makes it new. And I don't know, I'm not an historian. I'd love to hear from professional historians if we can identify a time in human history when one generation conscientiously reacted to a threat whose only manifestation would be several generations away. I can't think of an instance, but maybe some of you can.
Maybe I can ask Your Holiness to maybe give a comment here in terms of thinking about bad news versus good news, and whether bad news travels slower and is much more difficult for people to accept and then make change.
my own case, when we were in Tibet, no idea about the importance of ecology. I always is telling people that in Tibet, every water very sweet.
You can drink.
You can drink. After I reached India and also some different countries, then they say this water cannot drink because polluted. And then as a result of meeting some, I say the ecologist, environmentalist, scientist. Then I learned, oh, this is something very, very serious matter. And firstly, unlike violence, war struck in our mind immediately, bleeding, dying, and starvation, these things. When we see pictures from some African area at starvation or malnutrition,
Malnutrition.
and India also. These are very, very immediately struck in our mind. Then environment degenerate, not that kind of visible, invisibly, because of worse and worse. Once we actually, as you mentioned, I think, when actually we felt some sort of difficulties, eyes or breathing these things, then maybe too late. So therefore, after I learned these things from experts, then I realized this is very, very serious matter. So then, since the many decades, I always point out that we have the responsibility to take care about our own planet. This is the only our home. If something really happened, seriously happened here, then there's no other planet we can move. Moon, look in blue sky at night, very beautiful. 1,000 years, the poetry survey.
The poets.
Poets, you see, they mentioned that beauty of the moon. If we really go there, settle, horrible. So this is the troubled world, no matter how sort of troubled, but it's the only home. Therefore, we have to take sort of serious care as our own room. I think once our room, own room, due to sort of cold and some furniture burn, how can? It's your own sort of the home. Oh. So like that, so we have to sort of think seriously. So all this through education. Then also, I think this is very much related with, again, I think self-centered attitude. Then, yes, at least my generation, no problem. There's a more sense of concern of others' well-being. And yesterday also, as I mentioned, our children, grandchildren, grandchildren, then grandchildren like that. So we have the responsibility to think about their future, their life. That's, as a human being, you see, even animal, to some extent, the animal parent really very carefully think about their own youngsters' survival or properly grown like that. So we are a human being. We have this marvelous intelligence, this brain. So we have to use that brain and should have vision, long vision. So I feel everything, education. So like you, tell more. And then media people also, you see, should make clear presentation. The preservation of our climate or our environment is our own interest, not something like religious. The religion
duty,
also is, of course.
Moral duty.
What's the day? I don't know proper word, I don't know. Firstly, my English vocabulary was limited. And then secondly, getting older, my English also getting older, so it's difficult. 나 최소에서 유명도 양 가서 그러다. 딱 가서 저기 즉 괴미기 개주기 좀 말봤다.
So protection of environment is not a matter of luxury.
So it is a question of our own survival. So everything is dependent on education. So media people, and also I think religious people. One time, one organization, I think mainly in Hong Kong, about the environment. So they give me one sort of responsibility, mission work, all these sort of their document about the environment they want put in the desk of His Holiness Pope John Paul II. So I did that. One my friend, he said they want this document put in front of you.
No.
I put it. Whether he read or not, I don't know. So religious leaders, I think to some people, they say, I think the message from religious sort of leaders may be more effective. And then other kind of people, of course, the scientists, the specialist scientists, is make clear and with sort of detailed data as well. That's very convincing, very important.
Maybe you and I should have a road show together.
So that's my view. This is very, very much related with wisdom or knowledge, the realistic sort of look, and then also the moral sort of principles, concern about well-being of others. Yeah. Usually you see, forget these things, just think me. Almost sometimes people consider whole 21st century is century of me. How can? So that I think we should educate people. We are a social animal. We are part of that humanity. So each one have the moral responsibility for your own interest to think more about others' well-being. Not just a short sort of lecture, but systematic way from education field, from kindergarten up to university level, educate. This usually I call secular ethics right from the beginning. Then I think our intelligence get some kind of proper guidance. That's me.
Okay, thank you. I wondered, Tom, if you could just, so you get 30 seconds, because you created this thing called the Center for Collective Intelligence, and yet His Holiness talked about the self-centered attitude as an impediment to Kerry's message. Do you see, is there something you can offer us, just as a closing while the next speaker comes up?
So I think it's a very interesting connection. I think people sometimes believe that collective intelligence means our individual selves will be suppressed in the collectiveness of the whole group. I don't think that's always necessary. I think it's possible, for instance, to have collective intelligence emerging from interactions among people who are each selfish. In fact, many people would say that a free market is an example of that, an example of how a lot of selfish people can interact in such a way that some globally coherent good outcomes arise. So I don't think it's necessary to become selfless in order to have collective intelligence. But I think there are some really intriguing possibilities for what kinds of collective intelligence we could exercise on our planet if more of us are able to transcend the preoccupation with ourselves that I believe His Holiness is referring to.
I'm going to introduce the next speaker just briefly again for His Holiness and those of you who are here. So our second speaker is Rebecca Henderson, who is going to focus on energy needs, the economy, and the environment. She is the John and Natty MacArthur University professor at Harvard University and a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Her work is exploring how organizations respond to large-scale technological shifts, most recently with regards to energy and the environment. Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Your Holiness. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been asked to summarize approximately 25 years of my research in 10 minutes. So this presentation will be very abbreviated, but there are many people who could help you with these issues if you'd like more information, of course. I'd like to begin with a fact that is obvious, but I still find startling. The population of the world has tripled in my father's lifetime, in your lifetime, and doubled in my own. This has created issues. Most strikingly, humans seek natural resources. This is the fish caught on the Georges Bank, the most productive fishing ground in the world. It was fished out in the 1990s. Basically, humans took all the fish, and it still has not recovered.
His Holiness is asking the question why the graph is sharply down. Is it because
they took all the fish? They ran out of fish. And the very high peak, they took all the very young ones, so there was no children, so they took all the fish. Not a good thing. And the world's fishing populations are forecast to collapse by 2050, so within the next 30 or 40 years. So we take a lot of natural resources and we generate a lot of waste. My colleague, Professor Emanuel, talked about the greenhouse effect. This is showing that what we're doing is a roulette wheel. We are emitting all this carbon and other forms of waste, and we're not entirely sure of the impact it will have on the world. It may have a relatively benign effect. It may have really very extreme effects. So this is an issue. So all we need to do is transform the world's economy. We need... We need to go from a world where resources are cheap and waste is free, we can basically just throw things away, to a world where resources and waste are properly priced. I'm an economist. I believe if we understood the costs of what we were doing, that would enormously help the way in which we run our economy. So this is easy to put on a graph. Fortunately, it is completely possible. I don't say easy, I say possible. We have a fair sense of the technologies that would enable us, for example, to take the carbon out of the world's energy system. We believe that it would cost perhaps on the order of 2 to 3% of GDP. That's about $230 a head for every man, woman, and child in the United States. In the United States, assuming we would pay more because we have more money, it would be about $1,000 a head. That is less than half of what the United States spends on its army, and only an eighth of what we spend on healthcare. Indeed, if the US were to have a healthcare system more like that of Switzerland or Germany or France, it would cost about half. Healthcare outcomes would be roughly equivalent, and we'd have the money to pay for this. It's also possible, and I believe this, that once we started to try and innovate in this way, in fact, costs would come down. Once we started to try and really do this at scale, we would learn a great deal about how to do it better, and it would be cheaper. I can't guarantee that, but every other industry where we've really started to invest in change, costs have come down. This is an example from the cost of solar panels, showing the very dramatic reduction over the last 20 years. I think we could expect similar cost reductions in other technologies. The bad news is, although I believe it to be both technologically and economically possible, it's a human problem that we're facing. And I've spent my career working with large firms and trying to change them, and that's really hard. And now we're talking about changing an entire economic system. One of the issues I think it's very important to be aware of is that many proponents of the current system, many people who say, you know, be careful, we're doing really well, we don't want to change it, believe that the current system is intrinsically moral, that the economic system we have has brought, I've said here, prosperity and hope to billions of people. GDP per head, and these are figures from the World Bank, in the last 30 years has not tripled. It's gone up 6 times. And so it's very easy to say, oh, business is bad, capitalism is bad, we're destroying the planet, but we are creating wealth and hope for billions and billions of people. And I think that as we think about change, it's very important to be respectful of those who believe, as business people, they are doing a very good thing. And that's very important. It's also important to remember that this is not change at the margin. This is not saying, would you just recycle a few bottles? This is saying, get rid of fossil fuels, which is what has driven economic growth. The fundamental driver of economic growth is cheap energy, and that's come from fossil fuels. Even now, renewables are, depending on how you count them, only, say, 11% of the total energy mix, and most of that is hydro. So this is a very large shift. The energy sector is about 10% of the US economy. I believe it to be roughly that, a little larger for the world. That's enormous, but again, not impossible. If you think about World War II, which again is a useful analogy, we shifted the economy much more than that in World War II. So it can be done. $1,000 a head a year, I mean, I frame it this way because it doesn't sound like that much money, right? It's $300,000 million a year just in the US, and $1,000 million a year in the world. So it is a significant amount of money. And this is and we have talked about the fact that it is difficult to benefit the future. If you are a business person making decisions about what to invest in, you typically use what's called a discount rate. That is, you assume that if I have money next year, it's less valuable than money this year. Most companies use a discount rate on the order of 8%. If you apply an 8% discount rate to, say, $1,000, 30 years from now, it's worth almost nothing at all. So one of the problems we face is our economic system on its day-to-day decision-making doesn't really value the future 30 or 40 years out. So in addition to that, the people who will be most hard hit by these changes are people who are not right here and often look different from us, which is a huge issue. And another problem is that the costs of change are concentrated and immediate. If I'm a coal miner, I don't have very much money, I'm thinking, you know, you want to take my livelihood away. And that's a real problem. So the question is, what can be done? I'm hoping you have many good ideas on this front. The easy answer is we need appropriate regulation of the world's economy. So if we had accurate prices, if I knew that every time I emitted a ton of carbon dioxide, that was imposing costs on the future and on my fellow human beings, that would be enormously helpful. And we also need political support for large-scale innovation. We also need the ability to put such a regime in place. No politician in the United States right now can propose such a scheme because they believe they won't get elected. So we need widespread political support in order to put these things in place. So I think there are some sources of hope. Decarbonizing the world's economy is eminently technologically possible at completely acceptable cost. For me, a source of hope is the world's 1,000 largest corporations are 30% of the world's economy. That might seem strange as a source of hope. I know it makes some people nervous. I sometimes believe, however, that there is a real possibility we could reach the senior leadership of 1,000 firms or 500 and persuade them that it was really in their best interest to lobby and to work for a different kind of economy. That no one stands to gain from an economy that's under enormous stress. That this is really a body that could play a huge difference. And I think there's increasing consensus that business as usual may have unacceptable social and environmental costs. So I'll close by telling you my personal source of hope. I will be teaching a class next year at the Harvard Business School called Reimagining Capitalism, which is about how we could build an economic system that is capitalist, that is driven by the innovation and dynamism and competition that has generated so much growth, but that doesn't destroy the social and environmental capital on which we rely. I taught this class very quietly to 30 students last year and announced it to the whole student body this year. And more than 350 students, that's nearly half of the second-year class at the Harvard Business School, said they would like to take this. So I'm very encouraged that there's a lot of enthusiasm and engagement among young managers who are going to be running the firms in the future to deal with these issues.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Let me just prompt one question that your discussion that you...
I want to know.
Please, of course.
The last year, you carried this sort of class quietly. Why? Some opposition? Or not? You yourself not very sure?
I am an engineer and an economist. I sit on the boards of large public companies. to talk about reimagining capitalism among people in suits and to suggest, as I do when I teach, that we should be managing firms as much from an ethical and moral basis as from a financial basis is hard. The business people I meet want to have an ethical conversation. They know things are happening in the world. But we have built a system where it is considered inappropriate, even unethical, to talk about not making the best I can of my business and managing for shareholder value. And I think one of the most important things we can do is create a space where people can say, yes, I'm a good business person, and I'm responsible to my shareholders, and I'm a fiduciary responsibility is the technical term in English. But I also can build a business that serves my children and my children's children and creates a world in which we all want to live. And how to have that conversation in public is still a difficult thing. So it's a great question. Yes, I was very nervous. And it was the reaction of those 30 students that persuaded me that this was the right thing to do.
Wonderful.